All right, so I'm delighted to welcome you to the afternoon session, and the title of which is Stakeholder Perspectives of Checklists and Guidelines. And I have the pleasure of introducing our distinguished panel, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who's the head of editorial policy and research integrity at Nature Research, Dr. Malcolm MacLeod, professor of neurology and translational neuroscience at the University of Edinburgh, and Dr. Shai Silberberg, who's the Director of Research Quality at the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke at NIH. And as you could tell from our title, we're going to be focusing on checklists and guidelines, and we're going to be looking at that from the perspective of journals, from the perspective of funders, and perhaps we'll get into, I hope, the perspective of scientific societies. And if I can get this first slide, please. I think we have one previous slide. So this is the 500th anniversary of the death of Leonardo, so I couldn't resist sharing with you something he said 500 years ago, just to make sure that you realize that the issue of reproducibility was on his mind even back then, and I think this is still very good advice to young investigators. We are focused on checklists, and so I thought it would be fun to go back to this bestseller, Atul Gawande's book, The Checklist Manifesto, which I think had a major impact on people's thinking. And I thought that I would actually go through one of the paradigmatic examples related to checklists. And it goes back to 1935 when the U.S. Army wanted a new long-range bomber, and it held a competition. Boeing had the best plane by far, the 299. It was aluminum alloy. It had 4 engines, and the entries by the Martin Company and the Douglas were really by far less good. And it could carry 5 times as many bombs as was in the original requirements. It flew faster than the other bombers, and it flew twice as far. So there was no question this was going to be the winner. And the Army anticipated buying about 65 planes to begin with. Tragically, the plane took off, climbed to 300 feet, stalled, and crashed. And the pilot was a very, very experienced pilot, and he, as well as one of the other crew members, died in the crash. The investigation found absolutely no mechanical failure. The machine was flawless, but it was pilot error due to an unprecedented complexity of the instrument. They didn't appreciate that flying this plane was just a whole lot more complex, or a lot more things for the pilot to have to do and to remember. And so as a result of that, and you can see some of the things that the pilot had to be thinking about at all times. And he actually, the pilot, despite his expertise, forgot to release a new locking mechanism on the elevator and rudder controls. And the conclusion was that this was too much plane for one person to fly. And Boeing literally almost went bankrupt as a result. And they did award the contract to another provider, but they did buy a few of these 299s as test planes. And what they did was to bring test pilots together and ask them what did they think they needed to do to improve safety. And together they realized that training was unlikely to help because they had the best trained person who actually was involved in the crash. And so they decided to create a checklist, and that the checklist would be short enough to fit on an index card. And it was going to be step-by-step checks for takeoff, landing, and taxiing. And as they said, this was just dumb stuff. This was not anything really sophisticated. Well, this has a happy ending to this story. This plane actually became the B-17, which then flew 1.8 million miles additionally without a single accident. Ultimately, the Army chose 13,000 of these, and it played a very, very important role in the war in Europe. So I thought that it might be fun to just put up some ideas for thinking about these issues. And what I did was to put on the left what we just learned about that wonderful example and think about what it means to have a checklist for performing and reporting science in 2019. So the alignment of incentives in the case of the B-17 are absolute, because if something goes wrong, you're going to die if you're in that plane. Here, as we've talked about today, it's a lot more nuanced and subtle. You have all of the different issues of promotion and all of the rest in terms of the alignment. We have complexity. I say that 1935 was an analog world, and now we have a digital world. They dealt mostly with dials and binary switches, and I put this 50 shades of gray every time I do PowerPoint, and it says choose more colors, and then I realized that I used to have just a small selection of colors, and now I have an infinite variety. The number of decisions, the B-17, it was large but finite, and as we've heard today, given the complexities of all of the things we're talking about, it's virtually infinite, the number of decisions. The dependence on others, obviously, was a small but limited team initially, but now it's much, much more expanded. And the dependence on what I call black boxes. They had some, but nothing quite like what we have, and they could actually go and kick the tires. Now we have a lot of algorithms, and I think Arturo gave one example in one of his papers about how a single line of code in one algorithm led to the retraction of many papers because it was used over and over again. So that's sort of the background, and with that, I'm going to ask our presenters to provide their perspectives on this very important topic.